Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into one of the most fundamental philosophical stances out there. It's one that really sits at the core of, well, human experience. And it asks this incredibly critical question. Is reality defined mainly by the world outside us, or, by the complex world inside your head? We are tackling subjectivism, and our mission today, as always, is to take our source material, which, believe me, covers centuries of debate, and really extract the key nuggets. We want to trace the history of this, frankly, radical idea, break down its major forms nice and clearly, look closely at the arguments for it, because they are compelling, and then, weigh the really heavy criticisms against it.
Absolutely. Subjectivism is it's just such a broad and crucial stance because it fundamentally shifts where we locate reality. The core belief is that truth, morality, meaning all these big things, are entirely dependent on the individual's mind, their perspective, the subject. They don't just exist independently out there in the universe.
No.
Basically, if you take away the person perceiving concepts like good or beautiful or even true, well, they lose any universal objective status. They become essentially products of subjective experience of personal feelings.
Right, so the stakes feel incredibly high straight away. So the central assertion, the thing that really defines this philosophy for you listening, is this. Reality, meaning value, they're fundamentally shaped by the subject, the perceiver, not by some, neutral external standard. It feels quite powerful, almost empowering, doesn't it? To think I define the world I live in.
And that feeling, that sense of empowerment, that's actually a big part of its appeal. But to really get the stakes, it helps to look at the opposite view. Objectivism. Objectivism holds that truth, morality, they exist independently of us, right? They're out there, whether we perceive them or believe in them or not. So if you lean towards the subjective view, the practical implication is huge. What's true or right for one person might be completely different for another. And crucially, neither is necessarily wrong.
Okay. But that immediately sounds like, well, potential chaos, right? If my truth is different from your truth, how do subjectivists argue society can even function? Are they just saying, we should all just live in our own little perception bubbles?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And it points to the real tension here. Proponents wouldn't say retreat into bubbles. They'd often argue it's just acknowledging a psychological reality. We do filter everything. But to see how this works without total chaos, it helps to break it down into specific areas where subjectivism applies.
Exactly. To make sense of such a, sprawling idea, we structured our deep dive around the four main ways subjectivism tends to show up.
Okay, so let's start with the mind itself, with knowledge. This is epistemological subjectivism. Now, epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? And this branch claims that what we know, what we believe is true, is always filtered through our individual perception, our history, emotions, how our brain works. It's a really powerful idea when you think about it. The common way you hear this put is, we can never know the world as it really is, only how it appears to us.
Okay, so if I'm tracking this, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, back in the 18th century, he's a big figure here. You're saying he basically suggested our mind is like a pair of, complex glasses we can't ever take off.
Yeah.
We process the world through these built-in mental structures like space and time that shape everything before we're even aware of it.
Precisely. That's a great analogy. The world is out there, sure, but our access to it is always mediated, always through that lens. We literally can't step outside our own consciousness to double-check if our internal map perfectly matches the external territory. So the truth we end up with is always, in a way, subjective to that lens.
That makes a lot of sense for knowledge. That reliance on perspective seems almost unavoidable there. But does that same personal standard really hold up when we move from, say, facts to values, judging right and wrong? Because that brings us to the second form, moral or ethical subjectivism. And this branch asserts that moral judgments are purely based on personal feelings, on preferences, and therefore there just aren't any universally true moral values.
Exactly. In this view, moral language isn't about describing facts about the world, it's more expressive. So if you say lying is wrong, you're not stating a universal truth. You're essentially expressing your emotional disapproval of lying. It's like saying, boo, lying. It's an assertion of preference, which, puts it directly against views like moral realism, which insist moral facts do exist objectively.
Okay, but surely some things are just wrong, regardless of feelings? Does subjectivism really force us to say that even something like, say, torturing an innocent child isn't objectively wrong? Doesn't that kind of gut feeling prove the position wrong?
That is the absolute strongest objection, and it really highlights how radical this stance can be. A pure ethical subjectivist might counter that, yes, almost everyone shares a powerful negative emotional response to that horrific idea, but they'd argue the wrongness still resides in the strength and near universality of that shared feeling, not in some objective rule etched into the cosmos. The wrongness depends on consciousness, even if it's almost universally shared consciousness.
Wow, that's a tough one to swallow. Okay, so we've done knowledge, we've done morality. What about the third area? Maybe the most common one we encounter day to day. Beauty.
Yes, aesthetic subjectivism. This one's probably the most intuitive for most people. It's perfectly captured in that old saying, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Aesthetic value, things like beauty, depend entirely on the observer's response, not on any inherent quality in the object itself. Think about some highly conceptual modern art, maybe a blank canvas, or a piece of plumbing displayed in a gallery. Is it beautiful? Is it valuable? An aesthetic subjectivist says its beauty is entirely dependent on whether someone looking at it, the subject, can generate a meaningful interpretation or feeling from it. The value isn't in the plumbing itself, but in the framework the viewer brings to it.
Right, right. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me, moving beyond objects and even morals into like the whole purpose of our existence. This takes us to existential subjectivism,
Hmm.
right? Popularized most famously by Jean-Paul Sartre. And this view, if I remember correctly, argues that meaning in life isn't handed to us. Not by God, not by nature, not by fate. It's something we are basically forced to create entirely for ourselves.
Exactly. Sartre's famous line is that we are condemned to be free. Which sounds pretty dramatic, but it basically means, look, we exist first, and then we define ourselves. There's no pre-written essence or purpose. So we're forced to choose our own values, define our own purpose, in a universe that fundamentally doesn't care about us one way or the other. Meaning comes from our choices, our actions. If we just drift along, relying on what others tell us our purpose is, Sartre calls that living in bad faith. So the powerful conclusion is, life has meaning only because I choose actively to give it meaning.
That's a huge responsibility, isn't it? Being told you're the sole author of your life script. But this idea, this focus on the subjective self, it didn't just spring up with Sartre, did it? How far back does this kind of thinking actually go?
Oh, way back. You can trace the philosophical DNA, so to speak, all the way to ancient Greece. Think of the sophist Protagoras around the 5th century BC. His famous declaration, man is the measure of all things, is often cited as one of the earliest expressions of this. He basically meant individual human judgment is the ultimate decider of truth and value. A pretty radical idea back then, putting human experience above, say, divine law.
And that idea didn't just vanish after the Greeks.
No, not at all. It resurfaced really strongly in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment era, with philosophers like David Hume. Hume, being an empiricist, emphasized that all our knowledge comes from experience, from perception. And crucially, he argued that moral judgments aren't derived from reason or objective facts, but from sentiment, from feelings.
Hmm.
That laid a lot of groundwork for the moral subjectivism we talked about earlier.
Okay, then we jump forward to the 20th century, and it seems like this idea just exploded. You had movements like phenomenology, with figures like Edmund Husserl focusing intensely on the structure of consciousness itself, on our lived experience as the only reality we can be truly certain of. And then, yeah, existentialism with people like Albert Camus joining Sartre. They took that intense subjective focus and applied it to, well, the seemingly meaningless universe. They essentially said, since the outside world doesn't offer inherent meaning, the only authentic path is to embrace our radical freedom and create meaning from within.
So looking at this history, you have to ask, what's the big draw? Why would people embrace a philosophy that seems to, potentially erode shared truth and morality?
Well, the arguments for subjectivism are actually pretty compelling because they seem to lean heavily on things we can observe. First, proponents point to the sheer diversity of beliefs. The simple fact that different cultures, different individuals hold radically different moral codes, think about views on war, punishment, family structures, suggests, they argue, that maybe there isn't one single universal moral truth out there waiting to be discovered.
That's a big one. And secondly, there's that undeniable dependence on perception. We keep going back to Kant's glasses,
Yeah.
right? Our understanding of reality is just always mediated through our senses, our biases, our brain's wiring. We simply cannot access reality completely untainted by our own minds. So if perception varies, then reality as we experience it also varies.
And finally, there's the argument about freedom and authenticity. This feels particularly relevant today, doesn't it? Subjectivism empowers individuals. It gives you permission, even encourages you to create your own meaning, your own moral framework. It offers this radical, maybe even exhilarating freedom to define yourself without relying on old dogmas or external authorities. It's like the ultimate intellectual liberation.
And here's the big but.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it definitely raises an important question. What happens when we actually try to build a life, or even a whole society, purely on subjective feelings? Because the critics of subjectivism, they raise three really serious, almost devastating challenges. The first one, which you brought up earlier, is that pure subjectivism seems to slide inevitably into this paralyzing moral relativism. If all values are just subjective preferences, critics argue, then how can we universally condemn anything as objectively wrong? Even the worst atrocities, genocide, systemic cruelty, if it's right for me or right for my group, who are you objectively to judge? That lack of a universal moral anchor feels incredibly dangerous to many people.
Yeah, that's a really powerful counter. Because intuitively, most of us feel that some things are just wrong, period, regardless of culture or personal feeling.
And that leads right into the second challenge, which philosophers often call the incoherence problem. This is a fascinating, kind of mind-bending logical paradox. The claim is this: the statement, all truth is subjective, is itself presented as it's often seen as the Achilles heel of pure radical subjectivism. And the third major worry is about social instability. If all judgments, moral, aesthetic, maybe even scientific observations to some extent are purely personal, anchored only in the individual, then how do you justify or maintain objective standards in society? How do we have laws which rely on shared ideas of right and wrong? How do we even do science which depends on shared methods for investigating external reality?
Right. It seems like subjectivism creates this inherent tension between embracing your authentic self and, well, the basic needs of living together in a community. And yet these ideas clearly haven't just vanished. They seem really relevant in modern thinking, don't they? Like in psychology, for instance. Subjectivism fits really well with our modern understanding of how perception shapes reality, right? We see it in cognitive science, studies on cognitive bias, the power of the personal narrative, how someone views their past often shapes their present reality far more than the objective facts of that past ever could.
That's a perfect connection. And look at art and literature. Subjectivism is practically the engine. It fuels whole movements like surrealism, expressionism, art that deliberately abandons trying to mirror external reality perfectly and instead prioritizes the artist's inner world, their dreams, their emotional state. The value shifts to the experience of the creator and the interpreter, not just objective technical skill. And, in modern ethics, the core ideas of subjectivism are definitely still alive and kicking. They coexist with influential frameworks like cultural relativism, the idea that truth depends on culture, and emotivism, which we touched on, the idea that moral statements are basically just emotional outbursts. Both of those deny objective moral facts exist. So I think, to reiterate the key takeaway from this deep dive, subjectivism really challenges us. It pushes us to accept, or at least consider, that maybe truth, value, and meaning arise fundamentally from us, from human consciousness, from our internal world, rather than being found in some pre-existing external reality.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Well, on one hand, it can feel incredibly empowering. It champions radical individuality, personal interpretation. It grants you the freedom, maybe even the responsibility to create your own moral and existential landscape. It says your feelings matter, your perspective is valid. But it simultaneously challenges you to navigate a world potentially without those universal moral or existential anchors. You're the captain, but maybe there's no external map or North Star. And we'll leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. If the meaning of life is indeed entirely subjective, entirely self-created, what happens when two individuals try to live authentically based on their own deeply held self-created meanings, but those meanings are fundamentally incompatible? What happens when one person's authentic meaning requires the subjugation or even the destruction of another? That's the profound, maybe unavoidable tension you have to wrestle with in a purely subjective world.